All right, I wish everybody still very good morning. Hope you're all doing well. I would welcome you to the second morning session of Peace Reconciliation Conference for 2010. And I'm glad to be able to welcome some interesting scholars and their works for this morning. First, we are going to hear a paper about Ms. Laura Stackman. She's a doctoral candidate at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. She can't be here. She's enjoying her time in Washington, D.C., as far as I understand. But to present her paper for her is her colleague, Marilyn Andrews. She's also a doctoral candidate from the University of Wisconsin in Madison. And the title of the paper is A Century of Identity Reconciliation and the New Stage of Dayak Development. I understand that Dayak are indigenous people in Indonesia. Afterwards, we are going to hear from Professor Keith Sinclair. He is professor of political science here in GRCC. His presentation is entitled, What's Not Jewish About the Jewish State? The Answers Are an Existential Threat to Israel. And then finally, we are going to hear from Professor Mike DeVivo. He is a professor of geography here at GRCC, and the title of his presentation is The Proximity of Peace in the Face of Poverty and Conflict, Assessing Development in less developed countries, LDCs. So each presenter will have 15 to 20 minutes for their presentation, and after that we will welcome your questions. Enjoy, sit back, and let's give our welcome to Ms. Marilyn Andrews, who is going to present Laura Stackman's paper. Thank you.
So Lara sends her regrets, and before I start, I just want everyone to know I don't know very much about Indonesia or the Dayak. I don't speak Indonesian, so if I butcher some of these terms, please forgive me. Okay. For many people, Borneo today evokes images of lush jungles, unique animal species, and wild men who participate in savage rituals, such as headhunting and allegedly cannibalism. While the former are certainly true of the island, the latter must be qualified in that while the indigenous people were cast as barbarians and did experience what non-natives would consider a violent lifestyle, depicting the locals as a savage, bloodthirsty killers damages any understanding of Borneo's complex indigenous society. Dayaks, the majority ethnic group on Borneo, have incorporated an intricate system of warfare, hunting, and related traditions into their socio-cultural belief systems that have existed since the pre-colonial period. As foreigners reached Borneo, these small tribes were considered violent because of their traditional ways. In order to understand these groups, outsiders classified them all under one label, Dayak. Initially, this ethnonym was rejected as resistance to outside control. As foreign presence continued to dominate, circumstances emerged causing the Dayaks to unite slowly under this label. Today, the result is ethnic pride, though this greater unity was forged within the context of periodic or cyclical violence. Pan-Dayak identity was first conceptualized in 1894 at a Dutch-sponsored meeting to eradicate interethnic violence. Since this time, Dayak identity has undergone a difficult transformative process leading to the identity's acceptance. While the meeting pretended to make Dayak unity a possibility, Dutch actions post-1895 focused on dividing the Dayak population to assert complete control over Kalimantan, or Indonesian Borneo. The century after the meeting was punctuated with periods of greater cooperation, yet these times were precariously peaceful. External pressures affecting the entire Dayak population resulted in further identity strengthening, though frequently tensions that affected a smaller portion of the population resulted in inter-Dayak conflict that broke down group unity. The diplomatic model established within the 1894 peace accord was a groundbreaking event for the Dayak peoples, in that it demonstrated how negotiations conducted cooperatively could translate into pan-ethnic progress. Though the treaty had limited results at the time, one of its far-reaching effects was to call Dayaks together to resolve the issues that plague the entire island. While there have been several attempts to answer this call in Bornean history, the new plan of action, a delegation intent on uniting all Dayaks for regional rather than local progress, corresponds to the methods and precedents begun in the initial meeting. This new attempt at alliance shows that Dayaks are moving away from violence as a mechanism for resolving problems and are preparing to embrace cooperation to promote ethnic advancement. KMA Usap, a Dayak scholar, postulates that there are five major periods of Dayak unification between the 1850s and the 1990s. He refers to these events as pakats, or tacit agreements between the tribes. After each pakat, Dayak cooperation increased, though eventually it would regress into smaller tribal alliances. Dayak identity continued this pattern of strengthening and weakening beyond the period Usap examines. In the late 1990s, the authoritarian regime dissolved in Indonesia, allowing the Dayaks to unify again along ethnic lines. Changes within the government structure offered ethnic groups greater autonomy, and for the Dayaks struggling to survive as the new ethnic hierarchy solidified in Borneo, unity was expressed in the bloody anti-Madurese campaigns in Sampit 2001. Out of the ashes of this conflict, there has been a new attempt to prevent future violence. In 2008, the Indonesian National Assembly for Dayak Traditional Law, or MADN, invited Dayak leaders to embark on a tri-national journey for peace. Capitalizing on the internal changes of the post-authoritarian regime and the global momentum for indigenous rights, the expedition aimed to reposition the Dayaks to be involved in trilateral solutions for collective political and socio-economic gains. Under Usap's Pakat system, the Rapat Damai Tumbang Anoy in 1894, a meeting organized by the Dutch for the express purpose of ending intertribal violence, marks the second significant period in the Dayak unification. However, for purposes of understanding the emergence of Pan-Dayak identity, 1894 reflects the first time that the groups gathered as Dayaks to discuss issues that affect the group as a whole, resulting in the signing of a mutually crafted peace accord. For purposes of discerning how Dayak unity developed, this is the first time that Dayaks collectively agreed to make changes to sociocultural norms across the island, demonstrating the power of peaceful interaction over conflict. Negotiations during this meeting focused on resolution of ongoing tribal feuds that threatened peace on the island, particularly in the curtailment of the Kayu Mangayu, a cultural practice commonly associated with headhunting. Attendees included ethnic groups from the Dutch-controlled Kalimantan as well as parts of present-day Malaysia. Estimates of up to 1,000 Dayaks attended the proceedings, though only 71 attendees were official tribal representatives. The treaty officially ended headhunting practices, though other Kayu Mangayu traditions continued long thereafter. Locally, the treaty had great significance for Dayak peoples. Today, it is remembered as a symbolic moment where ethnic unity triumphed because the Dutch had their own agenda, but Dayaks did it for the sake of their tribe. Coming together to create the Accords exemplifies a significant episode of early Dayak unification that resolved many of the regional insecurities that had intensified since the Banjar War began in 1863. With the Accords, the precedent for Dayak unification was set. However, the unified Dayak identity construct did not have time to take hold, as the Dutch used the Accords as a way of further diminishing local ethnic challenges to colonial control. For the Dutch, bringing Dayak groups together was not about promoting peace and had no intention of teaching Dayaks the power of diplomatic negotiation. Dutch interests focused on consolidating control over the island, and the end of intertribal warfare allowed them to pursue their colonial interests with less interference from the natives. Less resistance eased Dutch ability to employ the usual divide and conquer strategies to increase purchase on territory and resources. As the Dutch began penetrating Kalimantan's interior in the mid-19th century, control over Borneo was easiest to maintain when specific groups function as hired mercenaries against natives, seen an obstacle to Dutch colonial policies. The Dayaks constituted a threat to order and security. The cheapest, most efficient way to restore order involved hiring specific groups to destroy anti-colonial threats. For example, in West Kalimantan, the Dutch employed Iban mercenaries to suppress uprisings by other indigenous groups. When the Iban overutilized violent tactics during government-supported skirmishes, the Dutch switched their strategy to employ Malays and other Dayak groups against the Iban. In South Kalimantan, the Maayan carried on a long peaceful existence based on trade with the Banjarese, working together to avoid Dutch taxation. When the prolonged Bajan War began to affect them in the mid-1880s, the Maayan found more benefits to cooperating with the Dutch and thus switched sides. Pitting native groups against one another entrenched the Dutch position as imperial controllers of this territory. In terms of colonialism, the 1894 peace treaty ironically strengthened the Dutch position on the island, as it was intended to do. During the major victory for Dutch colonialism, the peace treaty had an unintended long-term consequence for Dayak identity. The process of coming together showed Dayaks the value of cooperation and greater strength in unity. Within a few years, the region was less violent, proving to the natives that there were effective new ways of dealing with grievances accomplished through diplomacy, and that joint solutions improved conditions across the island. The act of coming together also promoted ethnic similarities, allowing the groups for the first time to imagine what it would mean to be united as Dayaks, as opposed to independent tribes and small alliances. Working together had accomplished something both tangible and intangible, and had led, if only temporarily, to a vision of peace and unity among the natives. Though this initial Dayak identity formation did not persist for long, particularly in the light of Dutch preference for divide and conquer strategies, the idea of Dayak emerged. Essentially, once conceived, the idea was impossible to eradicate. Though Dayakism would revert into dormancy for several decades, the idea of ethnic unification had become real and would resurface again in the early 1920s as a result of new political ideologies that would slowly enter the region and Dayak consciousness. Since the 1894 peace accords, Dayak identity formation demonstrated a propensity to unify when unity was perceived as the only way of making political, social, and economic gains for the group. Action under the unified identity label was occasionally peaceful, but often amounted to brief periods of violence when the groups deemed that bloodshed was the more powerful way to accomplish their goals. Returning to Usop's Pekat model, the 1920s followed the ideological trend prevalent throughout Indonesia, which included the establishment of political and social organizations focused on improving local conditions. With the founding of the Sarekat Dayak in 1919, its initial aim was to promote indigenous rights. However, the organization's goals shifted toward increased economic development through trade. By the 1930s, it focused on politics. The Sarekat Dayak, under the new name Pekat Dayak, started campaigning for Dayak representation on the Volksraad, the Dutch-approved parliamentary body supposedly allowing more native voice in the government. The Pekat Dayak attempted to use existing political and economic channels to improve life in Borneo. There is no recorded use of violence in the group's history, and during this period, cooperative strategies improved overall conditions. The next period of Dayak unification is strikingly different from the Sarekat Dayak's focus on economics and politics. Though the Indonesian state became independent in 1945 and fought against Dutch attempts at reconquest, the Dayak seemed to disappear from the historical record until 1957. After independence, the Indonesian state decided to reconstruct the Bornean provinces. As the ethnic majority on the island, the Dayaks lobbied to have their own province, a petition the central government denied. In response, the Dayaks called the Kongres Rakyat Kalimantan Tengah, or the People's Congress of Central Kalimantan, to meet in December of 1956 to decide on a response. Over 600 Dayak attended, showing support for their own province. One outcome of the meeting was the establishment of several revolutionary movements, the most radical of which was the Gerakan Madau Talawang Pakasila, or GMTPS, which used guerrilla-style violence that eventually forced the national government to create Central Kalimantan in 1957. GMPTS membership included approximately 42,000 members, a statistic equivalent to about 10% of the regional Dayak population. Violence only subsided with victory, the Emergency Resolution 10 in 1957, which officially established the province. With the ink drying on the edict declaring their own province, the Dayaks switched focus to concentrate on legitimizing their local religion, Kaharingan, viewed as an animist religion, had never received state approval and was therefore viewed as an illegitimate belief system. Under Indonesian law, only Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, Christianity, and Catholicism are recognized as permissible religions. Every citizen is required to declare one of these faiths and is legally barred from all other alternatives. Kaharingan did not fall within the 5 allowable religions, causing a misalignment between Indonesian law and local religious practices. Because the religion was so widely practiced in Kalimantan, the Greater Council of the Kaharingan Religion Greater Assembly formed in the 1970s to continue pressuring the government for official recognition. Ultimately, the Great Council was successful when the Indonesian government officially recognized the religion in 1980. Success was most likely due to the fact that the Great Council offered the government a way of legitimizing the religion without opening the floodgates for every animist religion to challenge state law. The council attached Kaharingan to Hinduism by pointing out similarities in religious practices, such as elaborate funeral ceremonies that often ended in crematory rituals. It also sanctioned a propaganda campaign to showcase similarities between the two, including how both religions have one primary deity, a specific place to worship, and utilized a holy scripture that specifies its preordained fasting days. The recognition of Kaharingan required prolonged petitioning of and negotiation with the government. The result was a political victory that legalized a long-standing traditional belief system, and the process required no violent action. Having been successful in gaining official status for their land and religion, the Dayaks changed their focus to identity strengthening. Dayak identity was still in the process of cementing when the Indonesian state faced dramatic overhaul in the late 1990s. It is in this context that the most recent act of Dayak unification occurred during the last decade. Due to growing tensions between the Dayaks and the Maduris, immigrants to Kalimantan through national transmigration programs, the region experienced high levels of violent, bloody clashes that eventually led to full-blown conflict in Sampit, central Kalimantan. By March 2001, official reports listed 419 dead, 93 wounded, and 88,164 forced to flee or face execution. Property damage included the destruction of 1,304 houses and 250 cars. Reasons for the conflict have been explained in terms of religion, culture, politics, and interethnic economic disparity. The actual reason is likely a combination of these factors, intensified by the nationwide instability felt after President Suharto stepped down from power in May 1998, resulting in several revolutionary and secessionist movements across the archipelago. Events in Sampit in 2001 currently shape how people from outside Borneo, including other Indonesians, understand Dayaks once again, as people prone to episodes of violence that include beheading, dismembering, and perhaps even consuming the enemy. There is no doubt that violent tactics were used to expel the Maduris, and that Dayaks have resorted to violence as a means of achieving their aims. However, violence used during this period cannot be understood as the Dayak resorting to the old stereotypes of the savage wild man. Rather, once the Dayaks perceived that their identity was irrevocably threatened by an outside enemy, the situation had already grown too great to begin with peaceful overtures. Because Dayaks had not used violent tactics for decades, in the late 1990s, the level of violence deemed necessary for self-preservation forced them to create earlier traditional systems of violence. For Bornean and Dayak history, these events mark a very recent dark period that show how quickly ethnic interests can erupt into conflict in the region. Today, Dayaks are promoting peaceful means of resolving problems to prevent the resurgence of violence along the lines of 2001. Beyond promoting peace, there has been a recent movement to improve conditions for Dayaks through international cooperation and discussion based on the 1894 model. The MADN, headed by Agustin Taraz Narang, the current governor of Central Kalimantan, embarked on a journey at the end of 2008 to unite all Bornean Dayaks in an island-wide cooperative envisioned to function similarly to the European Union. In early December, 150 MADN delegates traveled to Sarawak and Sabah, the Malaysian Borneo states, to discuss the establishment of the World Dayak Federation, an organization that would promote cultural heritage, interaction across national borders, ecotourism, and the pursuit of trilateral business opportunities. During the trip, the MADN delegation reiterated that Dayaks are already united through culture and must develop a clear vision and mission for future cooperation that would ultimately result in higher levels of investment and progress for the entire group, regardless of state citizenship. The World Dayak Federation has not yet been established today, apart from a Sarawak-initiated Facebook group espousing Governor Narang's vision. However, ongoing attempts to bring the group into existence point to a new period in Dayak history. Both the 1894 and 2008 meetings marked high points in Dayak identity dynamics during their respective times. The Rapat Damai Tumbangan Noi demonstrated the power of cooperation to achieve peace and regional development, essentially becoming the starting point for a pan-Dayak identity. Though the 100 years in between included periods of ethnic unification marred with violent episodes, the 2008 meeting marks another step in Dayak development. Through cooperative efforts, through cooperative efforts, Dayaks will be able to address perceived obstacles to their continued growth by coming together to resolve problems. A departure from past combative strategies that confronted the problem but concluded with a body count. Diplomatic meetings such as the ventures of the MADN and perhaps soon the World Dayak Federation promise to elevate Dayak interests as cooperation will open more opportunities to participate in regional, national, and even international development decision-making. With a collective mindset, Dayaks are no longer poised to revert to fighting to preserve their cultural identity. Instead, these new overtures at trilateral organization offer the chance to influence decisions that affect the group and the island as a whole. Together, Dayaks now have the opportunity to shape their futures with a collective voice that will have the power to be heard around the world. Thank you.
Professor Sinclair.
Thank you, Gord. Okay, the title of my talk, What's Not Jewish About a Jewish State? I guess what gave me the idea, in 2009, Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the Palestinians, was called out by Benjamin Netanyahu for not recognizing that Israel was a Jewish state. And Mahmoud Abbas's response was, what does that mean? And assuming that he wasn't just being coy, I think that the question is intriguing. What does it mean to say that Israel is a Jewish state? Certainly, its founders would have been torn over that terminology. In the 19th century, Zionism, in the late 19th century, Zionism came into existence, but not all Jews defined themselves the same way. There were many Jews who saw themselves as primarily an ethnicity, and then there were many Jews who emphasized the fact that it was a religion. And in Western Europe, where in the late 18th century, many Jews had been assimilated into the larger societies as the ghettos had been opened, the Enlightenment had liberalized attitudes, and many British citizens came to see themselves as British, even though the religion happened to be Jewish. Many French citizens came to see themselves as Frenchmen, even though the religion happened to be Jewish, and the same in Germany. And yet, in Eastern Europe, you saw much the opposite, where the ghettos persisted, and very much they were aware of their separate ethnic identity as they were segregated throughout that part of Europe. So much of the early Zionist movement in the late 19th century was fueled by many of the Jews from the East who saw themselves as a separate ethnicity. And that was a direct challenge to many in the West who preferred to see it as solely a religion. And they saw that the idea of an ethnic Jewish state as jeopardizing their status as British citizens, French citizens, or German citizens by calling their ethnicity somehow into question. And then you had, of course, the ultra-Orthodox belief who just called the whole idea of a Jewish state blasphemous. The idea that you would create through the present day and at that time the state of Israel through a mass movement was basically in opposition to the belief that God was going to restore the state of Israel by sending a Messiah. And until the Messiah had arrived, to even talk about creating a Jewish state was to be a heretic. And in addition, this new Jewish state ended up resurrecting what was a dead language, Hebrew, which had previously been only spoken in religious ceremony, was considered a sacred tongue. And the idea that you were going to create this modern state of Israel, which has in fact resurrected Hebrew as a common language, the idea of speaking this in a secular context was considered equally blasphemous by many of the ultra-Orthodox faithful at that time. In fact, in the early 1920s, you had many of the secular socialists who helped to found Israel even assassinating some of the ultra-Orthodox rabbis who spoke out vehemently against the founding of a state of Israel by going against the faith. So what is a Jew? Again, it depends on who you ask. It's a religion, it's an ethnicity, it's both. But that tension between the two has created an identity, as far as the Jewish state, a problem for most of the people who live there. After the Jewish state was founded, or I should say even before, many of the ultra-Orthodox came around to the idea of a Jewish state as a simple measure of survival, because during the 1920s and 1930s, as violence broke out between the Arab population and the Israeli, or I should say the Jewish settlers, many of them coming from Europe, many of the ultra-Orthodox who had opposed a Jewish state were caught in between. And because they didn't have weapons to defend themselves, many of them were some of the first killed. So many ultra-Orthodox Jews ended up accommodating themselves to the idea of a Jewish state because it was a means of protecting themselves. And yet, even today, there are ultra-Orthodox who are opposed to that, although few in number, opposed to the state of Israel. And I would mention the Neratrai Karta group. They still go around advocating the decommissioning of the state of Israel. They go to Arab countries. They form alliances with Arab groups. They've even been to Iran, talking about how the state of Israel is a heresy, and yet they are allowed in Israel. They have citizenship, and this puts them at odds with the majority of the population. Ben-Gurion, the socialist who helped to found Israel after the 1947-48 war, got many of the Orthodox on board by allowing them a monopoly over the control of basically who could become a Jew. The rabbinate could decide that, who could get married, that the marriages would be controlled by the rabbis, power over burials, religious education. All of this was given to them as a means to get them on board with the idea of a Jewish state. And to some extent that was successful, and they still control that today. This has caused a lot of angst amongst many secular Israelis who feel that, who may not identify with a particular religion, but they can't have anything but a religious wedding in Israel. To do otherwise, they would have to go or to marry a non-Jew, they would have to go to Cyprus, as many of them do. And so the religions basically control who can get married. Not only that, but they also recognize, or they determine who is recognized as a Jew, and that is someone who's born of a Jewish mother, or someone who converts in a way that practices the Orthodox version of Judaism. This has left many Americans, for example, who have to be Reformed Jews or conservative Jews out of the picture, and they kind of resent the fact that that the Orthodox Jews seem to have a monopoly on who is a convert and who isn't. And of course, the law of return allows children and grandchildren of Jews to come there, whether or not they practice the religion or not. All right, so here we have the state of Israel, and you can see the boundaries. Let's see if I have my, yeah. I'll stay next to the microphone so you can hear me, but the green and the orange would have been Israel as it was founded in 1948, and the yellow, the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, and of course the Golan Heights, the territories that were taken in 1967. Now, also what's not Jewish about a Jewish state, and perhaps the more obvious, is the non-Jewish populations that actually live there. And many Palestinians who did not flee this area and remained behind were eventually given Jewish citizens, or I should say Israeli citizenship, even though they were not Jews. The vast majority of Palestinians that fled were not given that treatment. and many of them ended up settling in the West Bank or beyond, and we know about the Palestinian diaspora throughout the world. And of course, in 1967, that problem was aggravated as more territory was acquired, both the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, acquiring even more Palestinians who did not see themselves as part of a Jewish state, but nor were they actually going to be given citizenship for the very reason that there was too many of them. Here you have a chart that shows kind of the breakdown. In Israel today, there are about 5.4 million Jews. In the rest of the world, 7.5, and the vast majority of them living in the United States. In Israel, you have, and in Israel itself, meaning they're Israeli citizens, meaning they were Palestinians that stayed behind after the 1948 war, they were given citizenship, and there you have 1.4 million Palestinians, or non-Jews. Vast majority of them Muslim, but also some Christian. In the West Bank, that territory that was taken in 1967, 2.4 million Palestinians, and in the Gaza Strip, another 1.4 million, and in the rest of the world, 4. So we've seen, kind of in common with the Jewish diaspora, which preceded it, a Palestinian diaspora as well. All right, so in Israel, the 5.4 million Jews and the 1.4 million Palestinians who live there are given citizenship. And this is an important distinction to make a difference between the Palestinians who have citizenship of Israel and those that do not. The Palestinians who have citizenship of Israel are often called by the Israelis Arab Israelis, and they have the right to vote. You know, they pay taxes. They don't necessarily have to serve in the army. And yet they're allowed to stay on their land. The Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza are not citizens of any place, really, because they don't have a state as the world recognized yet. Okay, so here you have a breakdown of the population, and you can see that the vast majority of Jews in Israel identify with being secular or traditional. And like I said, the early founding of Israel was predominantly by secular Jews. What's interesting is that as time has gone on, the political makeup of Israel has changed significantly as more and more, there's more and more non-European Jews of non-European descent and more Orthodox or ultra-Orthodox. Here you have the religious Zionists. These are defined by The Economist as, in which I got this chart, as those who settled the West Bank after the 1967 war, perceiving it to be the land that God intended them to live on. The blue area represents the ultra-Orthodox, which are sometimes called the Haredim, and many of these individuals are devout Jewish fundamentalists, follow the prescriptions of Jewish law, and also many of them dress in black, though many of those coming from Europe. And then, of course, there's the non-Jews in Jewish households. After the Soviet Union broke up in the early 1990s, many came from the former Soviet Union, and in fact from Russia. And not all of these Jews saw themselves as Jews. Jews were allowed to bring their spouses, bring some of their extended family, and even the rabbis didn't necessarily recognize them all as Jews. So you've got a population who may have some claim to be an ethnic Jews, but don't really see themselves as Jewish. Then, of course, there's this large block, which is the Arab Israelis, or what they might call themselves the Palestinians. The Palestinians in Israel who have citizenship of Israel, as opposed to those that do not. And as you can see, there are practically 1 in 5 Israeli citizens, not only not Jewish, but Arab. The vast majority of them Muslim, about 12% of them Christian. So here you have some various pictures of those represented in that chart. These are my representation of secular Jews. These would be the religious Zionist settlements in the West Bank. many of them built up on hills for defensive reasons. A traditional Jew, or ultra-Orthodox, the Haredim. I mean, this is what I mean when they dress in black, more traditional clothing, maybe akin to the 19th century. In fact, more than a few Jews who I talked to when I visited there said that their mindset is that of the 19th century. There's a very much of a tension between these Jews and the more secular Jews, and you can see that in its greatest contrast between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. Tel Aviv, a very secular city, and Jerusalem becoming more and more comprised of the ultra-Orthodox. In fact, in the old city, which had been in the what is technically the West Bank and was seized in 1967, when the Israeli government seized it, they envisioned that the Jewish quarter of the old city would become a great mix of various types of Jews. And in fact, it's really only become a place for ultra-Orthodox, as many secular Jews have not really wanted to be a part of that, and they've moved away. And you find even today many secular Jews leaving Jerusalem to go to live in a more secular city of Tel Aviv. They talk about the neighborhood turning black, and what they mean is the black clothes that the ultra-Orthodox actually wear. And of course the Wailing Wall. But the non-Jews, all right, so here you have an Arab Israeli. I believe this one, she was Christian. But there's also Muslims. The Christian Cross of Jerusalem, and the Arab Israeli political parties that are allowed to run in the Israeli Knesset, the parliament there. Many of them get elected, but obviously they're small enough that they're constantly dominated by the Jewish representation in that parliament. But they do have the right to run for office, they do have the right to vote, and they do in fact get elected. So you have at least 1 in 5 Israelis who are non-Jewish, and yet this is their flag. And their flag has a Jewish Star of David, although originally that was a more secular symbol when Israel was founded. It has come to be seen as a religious symbol. You know, in the 19th century, if you were to ask for a religious symbol of Judaism, they would have showed you a menorah, not the Star of David. And perhaps that's why the secular Zionists took it as their symbol, but it has come to represent the religion. And yet many, or 1 in 5, as I said, Israelis are not Jewish, and yet this flag doesn't really represent them, and yet that is what they're expected to pledge allegiance to. And of course the color scheme and the stripes are reminiscent of a Jewish prayer shawl. So imagine, I guess, to form an analogy in the United States, if we want to feel what it's like to be an Arab Israeli and have this as our flag, then I guess this comparison is what I think is the best analogy. You know, this is not the flag of the United States, and yet I can tell you probably there are people in the United States who would like this to be the flag of the United States. And yet imagine how exclusive that would be for those Americans who are not Christian, and yet they would be expected to pledge allegiance to this flag. I think you might see the tension in their own identity in that respect. So again, back to the question, what's not Jewish about a Jewish state? Well, certainly the more obvious one is that the Arab, if we're talking ethnicity, then we're talking about the Arab minority, 1 in 5. Right? We're also talking about a new Russian minority. 1 in 5 Jews now are identified as being Russian. I mean, they speak Russian instead of Yiddish. They don't speak, or Hebrew for that matter. That's their primary language. And these Russians have created their own tensions within the state as they've refused to assimilate, at least linguistically, as many of their other Jews have. Then there's all right, so the Arab Israelis, if we're talking religion, then we also have the Arab Israelis who are Muslim, and then, of course, those who are Christian. But there's also the Druze, who are also Arab. They're neither Muslim nor Christian. They're kind of a sect that broke away from Islam back in the 10th century or 11th century. They're small in number, but nevertheless represented. And then, of course, what's not Jewish about a Jewish state? It's those who question the secular nature of the state. Many of the ultra-Orthodox holding the state, even though they've reconciled themselves to the existence of the state, many of them hold the state in contempt, forming their own communities in the West Bank, obeying the Bible as their law as opposed to what the state's law happens to be. They're not obligated to serve in the military. And in some cases are find themselves in direct confrontation with Israeli law. And then there's those secular Jews who find the religious intrusiveness of the Jewish faith in the state and how it has seemed to control who can be a citizen, who can be recognized as a Jew, who can get married, and who can get married to who. So it is a difficult question. And perhaps another question is a Jewish state compatible with democracy? It's been said that that comparison is like a kosher pig, because in emphasizing the fact that the state has to be controlled by a majority of one ethnicity, is that truly living up to democratic principles? And if the Israelis are not a democracy, how sustainable is their state going to be? Now, I showed you the well, this is actually a secular Jew who's actually is in opposition to the Jewish settlements, and so not all Jews are comfortable with that. The non-Jews themselves had this painted on in Bethlehem, basically. But basically, I thought it was appropriate in that their very existence is their resistance to the state of Israel. And although this was one in graffiti that was in the West Bank, you could say the same also for those non-Jews that are recognized as citizens, the Arab Israelis. Their very existence is resistance. And so again, a Jewish state, it seems to be, it's not a Jewish state. I mean, they want it to be a Jewish state. But Israel, dare I say, is also a Muslim state. It's also a Christian state. It's not just a Jewish state. 1 in 5 Israelis are not Jewish. How can that number make it a Jewish state? It's got to be more than that. I would suggest that it has to be. Anyway, I've taken enough time. I'll defer to Mike DeVivo. Sorry, Mike, I think I encroached on your time.
Thank you, Professor Sinclair. I would invite Professor Mike DeVivo, please.
Thank you very much. There are some handouts being circulated, and there are being more processed as we speak. For those that don't have any handouts, I do not need. Well, I'll just keep it like this, and we'll talk about. Can you all hear me? Okay. You know, I'm not too quiet in my demeanor, perhaps, I suppose. Talking about the proximity of peace in the face of poverty and conflict, assessing development in LDCs. LDCs, what are LDCs? What are LDCs? No. Less developed countries. LDCs are less developed countries, and there is some argument concerning how these less developed countries are to be classified. I've spent quite a bit of time conducting research in this matter, and I developed the mic? I have to use the mic? Sorry. Okay. I've developed quite a research agenda about this particular topic concerning assessing development. And the handout that's been distributed to you is based upon a couple of things. One, some previous research in a recent publication in the Arab World Geographer concerning assessing development in the Islamic world. And I'll go over that, and then a modification for less developed countries as a whole. If you look at this handout, we see that there's a list of Islamic countries. which is a nice segue from Keith's discussion, I guess. And these are countries that have a population in which is characterized by 40% or more Muslim. And this makes up essentially the vast majority of the Muslim states of the world. That's table 1, if you have it. Now, if we look at table 2, on the other hand, we are associating these Muslim countries with regard to development vis-a-vis the United Nations Human Development Index. The Human Development Index, despite all of its good points, does have, I believe, some shortcomings. The Human Development Index is a way in which to assess development in the country with regard to health, with regard to economic matters, and with regard to social development. The measures used are the total literacy rate, life expectancy, and gross domestic product. Each of those variables, I believe, are considerable in terms of their shortcomings associated with assessing development. Life expectancy is too variable. There are some countries that are significant have-nots that have life expectancies that might not reflect their have-not statuses. Total literacy rate does not take into account gender issues. And of course, if we look at other measures, such as GDP, we know that that's not necessarily a good indicator of economic development, because a state might capture a high amount of wealth, but it might not filter down to the general population. So, despite all that, Table 2 indicates what the United Nations HDI is for each of these Islamic countries, essentially categorizing them into low, high, and medium classes. You can see that those that are extremely high, such as Kuwait, are essentially oil-rich states, and those that are relatively low, such as Afghanistan, have extremely low values demographically. For example, the life expectancy in Afghanistan is about 45 years of age. If you look at Table 3, Table 3 indicates what I have offered as an alternative. And I'm arguing that instead of looking at the HDI as a number which is a particular fraction of 1, a decimal of 1, a country that has a great HDI is going to be 0.9 something, whereas a place that is poorly developed is going to have a value that's much farther removed from 0.9 or whatever. Well, this alternative development index that I developed examines some other variables that we should consider. IMR, infant mortality rate. Infant mortality rate relates to the number of infant deaths per 1,000 live births in a given year. If we look at Afghanistan, for example, Afghanistan has the highest IMR of anywhere in the world at 155, so 15.5% of the infants born in Afghanistan die before they reach 1 year of age. Percentage of population under the age of 15 is also a valuable trait to examine because it gives us an indication of the number of dependents that exist in a particular society. If a place like Guinea-Bissau has 43% of its population under the age of 15, what are its opportunities for development? What can 43% of that population under the age of 15, meaning not just 13 and 14 years of age, but we're talking about children ranging from infancy up until their early teens, what can they do to contribute to society, contribute to the economy? Certainly not much. Urbanization is another variable I assessed, because with high levels of urbanization, we generally see a strong correlation with economic development, as well as with the development of a society embracing cosmopolitan values. There are higher levels of tolerance generally associated with societies that are highly urbanized. Life expectancy is thrown in there, not as part of the ADI that's developed, but to give you an idea as to what the life expectancies are for each of these countries. Total literacy rate and female literacy are also offered, so that you can note what the opportunities are for education in each of these places. Note again, Afghanistan, 12.6% of the female population is literate. 12.6% of the population can read, write, look at medical prescriptions if they're available, look at the sign on the bus. 12.6% of the female population can do that. Look at the sign on the bus to know where they might be going. We don't have data on that $2 value. What is $2? $2 relates to the proportion of the population living on less than US $2 a day. Let's go down to Mali. Mali, home of one of the first universities established in the world, in Timbuktu, an institution that 1,000 years ago was teaching higher level mathematics, astronomy, literature, and the arts to not only people north of the Sahara, but also in sub-Saharan Africa. Mali has 77% of its population living on less than $2 a day. And then SLE and FSLE, school life expectancy and female school life expectancy. We see variable numbers. Burkina Faso in sub-Saharan Africa has an average school life expectancy of 5 years. Children go to school for 5 years and they go to work. Whereas in other places, such as Algeria and Albania, the time spent in school is much longer. The next table, Table 4, compares the HDI and the ADI. And I am arguing that there are places that are categorized as being classed in a medium stage of development, according to the United Nations HDI, when they really should be considered low. Look at Mauritania, for example, an HDI value of 0.52, but I class it as low because it has really failed to meet some parameters that I've established that are dictated in the text. I'm not going to go into at the moment, but it has some characteristics that are more associated with lower levels of development by far than medium levels. Table 5. Table 5 gives us a summary of these Islamic countries that have been assessed, where they're located, and their levels of development. We have insufficient data for a number of these countries, but all in all, with regard to these countries in the Islamic world, we have, by and large, places that are characterized more by low levels of development than by higher levels of the development, yet the disparities are marked. So what does this all mean? In my article, I indicated that I believe that maybe a reexamination of development is in order. And some modification, perhaps, of this assessment that I developed might also be in order. Maybe we don't need to look at 8 particular variables. Maybe we could just look at 4 variables to note development in less developed countries. So I tackled this by examining first the countries of the world that have extremely high IMRs, infant mortality rates. And I looked at all of the countries that have IMR above 40. And they're listed here. There are 66 countries overall that have infant mortality rates of 40 or above. And then I noted what proportion of the population is under the age of 15. And we see that we have significantly high proportions of the population under the age of 15 that show strong correlations with these countries that have IMRs that are above 40. Perhaps a third of the population or better in these countries are, for the most part, above the age of, or excuse me, below the age of 15, which again shows us that the opportunities for development are negligible in comparison with those countries that might have somewhat older populations. F-Lit, female literacy. I'm not even bothering looking at total literacy. I was considering looking at school life expectancy, but I see that female literacy is a strong enough inference for solid school life expectancy. And so if we see low female literacy, we see a society that has fewer opportunities to develop even still. One of the faults with the United Nations HDI is, again, the lack of a gender empowerment measure or the relationship of equality, or I should say equality between men and women in a particular society. If we look at female literacy throughout these countries, we note that except for the ones that have been put in bold, and you can see this on the table, the ones that are in bold have female literacy rates of 80% or better. The ones that are not in bold have female literacy rates that are below 80%. Now, again, what we have done is we've moved away from just using the Islamic countries of the world as a sample and moved to the entire world, looking at all of the less developed countries that have infant mortality rates of 40 or higher and are associating these other variables with them. And I think we can gain a solid perspective on what the opportunities are for development by looking at these variables. Let's look at this $2 a day stuff, okay? Our last column. If we look at GDP again, GDP is an unfair, gross domestic product is an unfair assessment of how funds will be filtered down to a given population. If we look at $2 a day, proportion of people, proportion of the population that live on less than $2 a day, we get a better handle on what poverty is like in these particular countries. And in some cases, we see that it's abysmal. The CDR, Democratic Republic of the Congo, 80% of the population living on less than $2 a day. And we see a number of countries where the proportion of population living on less than $2 a day is extremely high. Note that this table, by the way, goes to the back. It continues in the back. There are S's. Interestingly, you know, we have a country, perhaps the most promising country in Africa is South Africa. We have an IMR of 46. 31% of the population is under the age of 15. 85% of the female population is literate. And we see that still 43% of the population is living on less than $2 a day. What does this all mean? I mean, we have all of these numbers. Is there any sense that we can draw from this? And I believe we can. Let's look at this summary in the back on page 8 here. And we're looking at 66 countries of the world, almost a third of the world's countries. Of those 66, 53 have a female literacy below 80%. And we are looking at all but 10 of the countries in Africa. So we have listed here all but 10 of the African countries would be considered very poorly developed according to this assessment. And that accounts for 860 million people in the world. You know that there are 6.9 billion people in the world, more or less, today. So 860 million, almost a billion. We throw in there another 1.56 billion from most of South Asia. Look at that. India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, Bhutan. These countries border each other, and they are also on this list. I mean, let's take a look at India just for a minute. You want to do that? Let's look at India. Go ahead. Go back to the page. We see India has an IMR of 53. 32% of the population is under the age of 15. Female literacy is under 50% at 47.8. And 76% of the population lives on less than $2 a day. And this is, quote unquote, the world's largest democracy, where there is a marked contrast between the haves and the have-nots. In any event, when we look at this list in total, and we assess all of these countries that are on here, and again, the common denominator is IMR, 40 or higher, and all of these things fit in. Very, very significant correlation. I've not run a regression analysis on this. I don't think we need to. An arithmetic evaluation would be fine, just to note this very strong relationship between these particular variables. IMR, percentage of population under the age of 15, female literacy, and the proportion of the population that makes under $2 a day. We're dealing with 40% of the world's population. So what does this all mean? What does this all mean? And as we reflect upon this particular bit of information and attempt to compare and contrast this with other studies that have been presented here throughout the course of this conference, we might think about preventing conflicts before they might occur, because these variables indicate for us the likelihood of various conflicts to occur, as there very well could be the threat of conflict, as despair is characterized by a large number of people who are struck by these low development indicators, these low levels of a way of life. Let's go to Afghanistan for a moment and think about this. In Afghanistan, a young mother can expect to live to be only 44, 45 years of age, and she will likely see a number of her children dying before the end of their infancy. By the time they're 5, I believe there's a 1 in 4 chance of her children dying, certainly 15% chance of them dying before they reach 1 year of age. And most likely she's not literate. She can't read or write. What prospective solutions might we be able to present in lieu of engaging in conflict, what might we be able to do in a number of situations to preclude conflict? There are a number of students who've examined this issue in detail who have argued that gender empowerment is one of the keys to preventing conflict in many parts of the less developed world. How might that occur? Well, through embracing long-term planning and facilitating the education of young female students. Is this a viable solution in the short term? Probably not, but it might be wise for us to consider moving beyond the idea of attempting to resolve things in the short term and adopting long-term strategies. It might not be a wise idea to consider doing these things. Perhaps we should be more proactive than reactive in parts of the less developed world that show a likelihood of future conflict. There's more that I could say about this. I could go on, but I think that's about it for now. Does anybody, oh, I should probably turn this over to you, huh, Gordon? That's okay, go ahead, thank you. Thank you.
I would like to thank all of our presenters. I would like to invite them to join us over here at the desk in front of the audience so that they can answer the possible questions. Yeah, sure, of course. I have a microphone. Is it working? Okay, does anybody have any questions?
I had a question on the presentation about what's not Jewish about a Jewish state. You mentioned, Professor St. Clair, that it was impossible for a non-Jewish, a non-Jew to become head of the Israeli state. Is that in their constitution, or is it just you're going off the demographics?
I don't remember saying that a non-Jew couldn't
Okay,
become
I
head of
misunderstood you.
a Jewish state. I don't remember saying that at all.
Okay, I misunderstood you. So I'm glad I asked the question
Did I say
because
that?
I'm. Yeah, okay.
I don't pay attention to you ever since you left.
And then,
I mean, it's unlikely. I mean, because the non-Jews are certainly in the minority. Maybe
Okay.
maybe that's what I
that's part,
was saying. I mean,
I
they are
misunderstood you then. Okay.
right. I mean, there's only 11 Arabs in the whole Knesset in the Israeli parliament. So 11 out of 120, they're not easily going to become prime minister unless they have a majority, and that's unlikely to happen. I didn't mean to suggest that there's a law that prevents it.
Okay,
Is
I
that what you're saying?
misunderstood you. I thought that
Yeah.
You were probably just going off the likelihood. And then, looking at the tables that you presented, Mike, I guess my question is, like, when I look at the IMR and then the great percentage of people under the age of 15, is there, in your research, or have you been able to find out what would cause that? I mean, why is the birth rate so much higher in those countries? I mean,
Or why is infant mortality so much higher?
well, I would think that if you watch so many children die, how do you accumulate so many people under the age of 15? But what affects is a fertility rate? I would think that most people psychologically would be sad and depressed, and at the loss of a child.
We would
And
probably think that.
But
It's a loaded question that you ask, and I'll try and touch upon a few of these things because it's an imperative that I think we should address. We do see that the crude birth rate far exceeds the crude death rate in less developed countries, though both rates are very high, the highest in the world. It's just that there are more births than there are deaths. Thus, the natural increase rates are going to be extremely high. We can expect a number of those countries to double by 2050. Now, why are there a number of infant deaths, and why are we experiencing also a high proportion of the population under the age of 15? Why is the population increasingly becoming younger? So much of that does appear, according to a number of social scientists, to be associated with gender disparities as well as the human health condition. If you notice, most of those countries are located in Africa, and in Africa, there have been some recent studies conducted concerning the physiology of women, which makes them physiologically less suitable for engaging in safe childbirth more often than people elsewhere. And I could show you where some of that research has been conducted. We also see, however, that just the simple fact of poor nutrition accorded to females, because they are lower echelon citizens, if citizens at all, and poor health care is a factor as well that relates not only to IMR but maternal mortality, which I didn't provide you with figures on. But those things are strongly related, and it really does appear that it has become, in some ways surprisingly, a gender issue across the globe. There's some things I can't figure out exactly. For example, if we look at some of the former Soviet republics, we see high IMR, and we also see high levels of female literacy. And I suspect that the high levels of female literacy are associated with the previous communist government, but I can't get a handle on why we see high IMR in those countries.
I guess
I
one
just
other
wanna
thing too would
make
be the urbanization part, because
Pardon me?
it seems, are most of these, are they still mostly agriculture or fairly small villages?
Yeah,
Is that
most
part of it?
Yeah, most of these countries on the list that is characterized by having IMR of 40 or better are predominantly rural countries, although we do see that there is a tendency for rural to urban migration to occur throughout this part of the world, as well as elsewhere throughout the less developed world. And we see urbanization increasing, but then we also see less likelihood of proper sewage and water availability too.
Thank you.
I just wanted to make a quick comment about what you said about why do they keep having kids if, they're just going to die, and the depressed thing. In my anthropology, I've studied this a little bit, and I just want to say that different cultures have different ways of dealing with this, and I can't speak specifically to some of the countries, but I do know in some cultures they don't view their kids as people until they reach a certain age, and that's one of the ways that they deal with the fact that so many of their kids are going to die. So they weren't people anyway, so it doesn't have quite the effect, but they have different ways of dealing with it, and I just wanted to point that out.
One more question? I think we are recording, so.
On a little more optimistic note, hopefully, has there been studies done at all on how long it takes once you have schools in place and once women are being educated and literate and taken care of, how long it takes for that to make an overall impact on the numbers that you laid out there?
I think you're talking to me, huh?
Yes,
Okay.
yes, I am talking to you, Mr. DeVimo.
I can't comment on that with a lot of knowledge, but I can tell you what I've learned. it does appear that the efforts that are more grassroots oriented rather than national or even regional are far more effective. And so we see in certain instances there is an impact over the course of 7 to 10 years on the local level. Part of this, of course, relates to leadership in local communities that is willing to be what we might refer to in the literature as transformational. We might attempt to bring the people in a community to a higher moral calling, if you will, and it requires changing in some ways the culture, because we see that some cultural some traditions are lost with the education of women. But you know, you have Mortensen running around in Central Asia, and he's the 3 cups of tea guy, if you're not familiar with him, and he talks about how effective it has been accomplished in Pakistan, for example. And you have Nicholas Kristof, the very solid New York Times columnist who's spent a lot of time devoted to these issues. He's just written in the last several months a book called Half the Sky, which is very revealing about some of these matters and how quickly some local communities can benefit. But the problems are very complex beyond the grassroots efforts, because in large regions or states, in the geopolitical sense, there is a heavy dose of corruption that impedes the progress, despite the efforts of NGOs and the United Nations. I don't know if I answered your question, but that's,
Yes, you did.
I think
Thank
that's
you.
the best I can do.
Gordon, would you mind if I interject? Just to anybody who's interested, before we adjourn, December 28th, I'm leading a group to Israel. It's not a class, but it will be educational. December 28th to January 7th. I have a brochure that I can email you if you want to come up and give me your email. And I think you can see firsthand what a fascinating country Israel is, and what a more diverse country than you imagine it to be. I think you'll see that when you're there.
All right, unfortunately we are out of time. I would like to thank our presenters for excellent presentations. And I would like to thank all of you for coming. I hope you